They say the line between life and death is measured in minutes, but what if everything changes in the time it takes for a single heartbeat to disappear from a screen? In the heart of Chicago, the morning sky had barely begun to brighten when Emily Carter was brought into the intensive care unit, her body moving through corridors filled with urgency, monitors beeping in uneven rhythm as medical staff worked with controlled precision to stabilize a condition that had already crossed into critical territory. Inside the hospital, every sound felt amplified, every step measured, every decision carrying weight that could not be undone. At that same moment, miles away in a glass tower overlooking the financial district, Jonathan Pierce stood at the head of a boardroom table, his presence calm, calculated, and detached, as executives finalized a deal worth millions of dollars without a single emotional deviation breaking his expression. He was a man known for absolute control, someone whose decisions shaped industries, yet whose personal world remained locked behind silence and discipline. A phone vibrated once on the table beside him, then again, interrupting the final signature being reviewed on a contract. One of his assistants answered it with hesitation, only to pause mid-conversation, the expression on their face shifting in a way that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. The words were simple, but they carried weight that no financial report could match. A staff member from his residence had been admitted to emergency care, condition unstable, survival uncertain. For a moment, Jonathan did not react, his eyes still fixed on the document in front of him, as if processing the information required no immediate response. The room waited, executive silent, unsure whether the interruption would be acknowledged or dismissed. Then, without speaking, he closed the folder in front of him, stood up from the table, and adjusted his jacket with a calmness that betrayed nothing of what had shifted inside him. No explanation was given, no instructions delayed, only a quiet departure that left the boardroom suspended in uncertainty. Back at the hospital, Emily Carter lay surrounded by machines that maintained the fragile boundary between instability and survival, her condition monitored in real time by specialists moving in coordinated urgency. The attending physician reviewed her chart with visible restraint, noting that her status remained critical, with minimal response to treatment and an unpredictable trajectory that required continuous intervention. Yet what no one in the room could anticipate was the arrival that would soon change the rhythm of every decision being made inside those walls. As Jonathan Pierce stepped out of his vehicle at the hospital entrance, the contrast between his composed exterior and the urgency inside the building became immediate, though his expression remained unchanged. He moved through the entrance without hesitation, his presence drawing attention not through force, but through the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to control. And as he made his way toward the intensive care unit, unaware of every detail yet unwilling to accept distance from what was unfolding, the entire system around Emily Carter was about to shift in ways no one inside that hospital was prepared to measure. The hospital corridor outside the intensive care unit felt colder than it should have, not because of temperature, but because of the silence that followed the arrival of someone who did not belong to its ordinary rhythm. Jonathan Pierce moved through it with steady control, his footsteps measured against polished floors that reflected the sterile white lights above. Every staff member he passed seemed to register his presence without fully understanding it, as if instinctively recognizing authority without knowing its source. Inside the intensive care unit, Emily Carter remained surrounded by machines that continued to fight for stability on her behalf, each monitor tracking fragile signals that fluctuated between uncertainty and minimal improvement. The medical team worked with disciplined urgency, adjusting medications and recalibrating equipment with careful precision, yet there was an unspoken awareness that her condition remained dangerously unpredictable. A senior physician stepped forward as Jonathan arrived at the glass entrance, beginning a brief explanation of her current state, using clinical language that described instability, low responsiveness, and a narrow window for meaningful recovery. Jonathan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, absorbing every word without revealing reaction, as if processing the situation through calculation rather than emotion. Then, without asking permission, he stepped closer to the glass separating him from the ICU room, his eyes locking onto Emily's still figure under the soft sterile lighting. For a moment, the sound of machines filled the space between them, steady yet fragile, marking each passing second with mechanical precision. A nurse nearby hesitated before gently informing him that access to the ICU was restricted, but the sentence faded as soon as it was spoken, not through confrontation, but through the quiet authority of his continued presence. Inside the room, Emily's condition showed no dramatic change, but subtle fluctuations on the monitors indicated that her body was still responding, still holding on in ways that defied certainty. Jonathan's gaze did not shift, yet something in his focus deepened, as if the abstract explanation he had been given was now being replaced by direct observation that required no translation. The physician continued speaking, mentioning treatment limitations and procedural constraints, but the words began to feel secondary to the reality unfolding behind the glass. Jonathan finally raised a simple question, asking what was required to ensure continuous intervention without interruption, and when the answer involved coordination across multiple departments, he gave a single brief acknowledgement that carried the weight of immediate authorization. Without raising his voice or making any visible gesture of command, the response altered the atmosphere around him, as if the hospital itself had begun to recalibrate its priorities in real time. Within minutes, communication channels shifted, additional specialists were contacted, and internal processes that normally required approval cycles were expedited without visible delay. Yet Jonathan remained still. Not observing the system responding to him, but the person within the ICU who remained at the center of it all. A memory surfaced briefly, uninvited but clear, of Emily Carter once quietly assisting a situation in his household without recognition or expectation, performing a small act of order that had gone unnoticed at the time but now carried unexpected relevance. That memory did not change his expression, but it settled into his awareness with increasing weight. Around them, the hospital continued its controlled urgency, but the balance of attention had already shifted toward a single point of focus, where fragile life continued to resist uncertainty, and where Jonathan Pierce stood unmoving at the threshold of something that no longer belonged only to procedure or logic. The atmosphere inside the hospital had shifted into a sustained state of controlled urgency, where every corridor felt occupied by quiet purpose and every movement carried an unspoken awareness of the fragile situation unfolding behind the intensive care unit glass. Jonathan Pierce remained standing near the observation point, his presence steady, his attention fixed entirely on Emily Carter as medical staff continued to move around her with disciplined coordination. Inside the room, her condition remained critical but no longer entirely unstable, as the monitors reflected subtle variations that suggested her body was still responding to treatment, even if recovery remained uncertain. A senior physician approached once again, carrying updated readings that confirmed slight stabilization over the previous interval, though the tone of the report remained carefully restrained, emphasizing caution over optimism. Jonathan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, yet the focus in his eyes remained unbroken, as if every word being spoken was being measured against something far more personal than clinical data. Around them, the hospital staff continued their work with increased coordination, and although no official announcement had been made, the internal system had already begun adapting to a higher level of priority assigned to the patient. Additional specialists were contacted, treatment schedules were adjusted, and resource allocation shifted in subtle but significant ways, all without disrupting the visible calm of the environment. Jonathan did not acknowledge these changes outwardly, but his silence carried the weight of approval, and that alone was enough for the system around him to continue adjusting itself. At one point, a nurse cautiously informed him that the patient had shown minor responsiveness to external stimuli, a detail that might have been insignificant under normal circumstances but now carried amplified meaning due to the ongoing context. Jonathan's gaze did not move from Emily, yet his posture shifted slightly, as if acknowledging the importance of even the smallest sign of continuity. A memory surfaced again, clearer than before, of Emily Carter once quietly intervening in a moment of disorder within his residence, not for recognition, not for reward, but with an instinctive sense of responsibility that had gone unnoticed at the time. That recollection remained unspoken, yet it lingered with increasing relevance as he stood there observing her now. The physician continued explaining procedural limitations and projected outcomes, but his words were increasingly overshadowed by the real-time data displayed on the monitors inside the room. Jonathan finally asked whether there was any method to ensure uninterrupted stabilization efforts through the night, and upon receiving confirmation that extended coordination would be required, he issued a brief acknowledgement that immediately translated into action within the hospital's administrative structure. Communication channels were adjusted again, and internal workflows shifted to accommodate continuous oversight without procedural delays. Despite this, Jonathan remained physically still, his attention never leaving the glass that separated him from Emily, as if proximity alone had become a form of presence that did not require movement. The surrounding environment continued to operate with controlled efficiency, yet the emotional weight of the situation had begun to redefine how time itself was being experienced within that space. Each passing minute carried significance not because of urgency alone, but because of what it represented in terms of possibility. And as the hospital continued its silent adaptation around a single fragile life, Jonathan Pierce remained anchored at the center of it, observing not only a patient in critical care, but something that had begun to alter his understanding of value, responsibility, and presence in ways that could not yet be fully named. The hospital environment had settled into a quieter form of vigilance, where urgency no longer expressed itself through visible chaos but through sustained precision and controlled attention. Inside the intensive care unit, Emily Carter remained under constant monitoring, her condition still classified as critical but no longer deteriorating at the rate observed earlier. The medical team continued to operate with coordinated efficiency, adjusting treatment parameters in response to real-time fluctuations that remained delicate and unpredictable. Outside the glass observation barrier, Jonathan Pierce stood in the same position he had maintained for hours, his posture unchanged, yet his awareness fully engaged with every subtle update coming from within the room. A senior physician approached with another report, explaining that the latest readings indicated continued stabilization, though recovery could not yet be confirmed and required extended observation through the next cycle. The language remained careful and clinical, but even within its restraint there was an acknowledgement that the situation had shifted from immediate crisis into a fragile state of potential continuity. Jonathan listened without interruption, his expression steady, absorbing the information without visible reaction, as if processing each detail through a deeper internal framework rather than immediate emotional response. Around them, the hospital continued its silent adjustments, with additional specialist consultations scheduled and monitoring protocols extended beyond standard duration, all quietly aligned with the evolving condition of the patient. No announcement was made, yet the operational structure of the floor reflected a clear prioritization that had formed organically around the ICU room. At one point, a nurse gently noted that Emily had shown repeated signs of responsiveness to external stimulation, small but consistent indicators that suggested her condition was no longer static. Jonathan's gaze remained fixed on her, yet something in his focus subtly shifted, as if the accumulation of minor improvements had begun to alter his perception of the situation itself. Another memory surfaced again without invitation, of Emily Carter performing a quiet act of assistance within his household during a moment of internal disorder, an action that had once gone unnoticed but now carried new significance in the context of what he was witnessing. That memory did not change his outward expression, but it deepened his internal awareness of continuity between past observation and present reality. The physician continued speaking about procedural constraints and projected outcomes, yet the weight of those explanations seemed increasingly secondary to the live data displayed within the ICU. Jonathan finally asked whether continuous stabilization efforts could be maintained without interruption through the next critical period, and upon receiving confirmation that extended coordination would be required, he gave a brief acknowledgement that immediately translated into system-level adjustments across the hospital's internal structure. Communication pathways were refined once more, ensuring that any delay in intervention would be minimized, and resource allocation was quietly expanded to support uninterrupted care. Despite these changes, Jonathan did not move closer or step away, remaining instead at the threshold between observation and presence, as if distance itself had become irrelevant to his engagement with the situation. Inside the ICU, Emily's condition remained delicate but stable enough to sustain cautious attention rather than immediate escalation, and every monitored fluctuation reinforced the importance of continuous oversight. The surrounding environment maintained its controlled rhythm, yet the emotional weight of the moment had begun to settle into a different form, one defined not by urgency alone but by sustained responsibility. As the hospital continued its quiet adaptation around a single fragile life, Jonathan Pierce remained still, watching without interruption, as the boundary between professional control and personal recognition continued to narrow in ways that were becoming impossible to ignore. The hospital had entered a phase of sustained stability, where the urgency of earlier moments had not disappeared but had instead transformed into a continuous, controlled vigilance that defined every movement within the intensive care unit. Emily Carter remained under close observation, her condition still classified as fragile but no longer showing the same unpredictable decline that had marked her arrival. Subtle improvements continued to appear in her readings, each one small on its own but significant when viewed as part of a sustained pattern over time. Medical staff moved with careful coordination, adjusting treatment plans in response to ongoing evaluations, while maintaining a quiet awareness that every adjustment carried importance beyond routine procedure. Outside the glass partition, Jonathan Pierce stood in the same position he had maintained since arriving, his presence unchanged in posture yet deeply engaged in attention. A senior physician approached with another update, explaining that Emily's response to treatment had remained consistent through the latest monitoring cycle, and while full recovery was still uncertain, the stability of her condition now allowed for cautious continuation rather than emergency escalation. Jonathan listened without interruption, his expression steady and controlled, absorbing the report without visible reaction, yet his focus remained entirely fixed on the figure inside the ICU room. Around them, the hospital environment continued its quiet recalibration, with extended monitoring protocols in place and specialist availability maintained at a level that ensured uninterrupted care. No formal declaration had been made, yet the structure of operations around the ICU reflected a clear and sustained prioritization that had formed organically since his arrival. At one point, a nurse quietly observed that Emily had shown repeated signs of responsiveness over the past hour, subtle indicators that suggested her condition was no longer static but gradually evolving. Jonathan did not respond verbally, but his attention sharpened slightly, as if registering the significance of continuity rather than isolated change. Another memory surfaced again without prompting, of Emily Carter performing a quiet corrective action within his household during a moment of disruption, not seeking recognition but restoring order in a way that had once been overlooked. That memory now carried a different weight, aligning itself with the present in a way that reinforced a growing sense of recognition that had been forming gradually since his arrival at the hospital. The physician continued to explain procedural boundaries and projected recovery timelines, but the words increasingly felt secondary to the real-time data displayed within the ICU, where every fluctuation carried immediate relevance. Jonathan finally asked whether sustained stabilization protocols could remain active without interruption through the following critical period, and upon receiving confirmation that such continuity required ongoing coordination across departments, he gave a brief acknowledgement that immediately translated into system-level reinforcement across hospital operations. Communication channels remained active, specialist schedules were extended, and resource allocation continued to adapt silently to the demands of continuous care. Despite these changes, Jonathan remained physically still, positioned at the threshold of observation without crossing into intervention space, as if presence alone had become sufficient to maintain alignment with what was unfolding inside the room. Inside the ICU, Emily's condition held within a narrow but stable range, her readings reflecting cautious progress that had not yet reached certainty but had moved beyond immediate danger. The surrounding environment maintained its controlled rhythm, yet the emotional weight of the situation had begun to settle into something more enduring, defined not by urgency alone but by sustained responsibility and attention. As the hospital continued its quiet adaptation around a single fragile life, Jonathan Pierce remained unmoving, his gaze fixed through the glass, as the boundary between detached authority and personal recognition continued to narrow in ways that could no longer be easily dismissed. The hospital had fully transitioned into a state of sustained clinical vigilance, where urgency no longer appeared as chaos but as structured continuity maintained across every department connected to the intensive care unit. Emily Carter remained in critical but stabilized condition, her readings no longer showing sharp decline but instead fluctuating within a narrow and carefully monitored range that required constant attention rather than emergency escalation. The medical team worked in coordinated cycles, ensuring that every adjustment in treatment was supported by immediate review and confirmation, reflecting a system that had adapted itself around the fragility of a single life. Outside the glass barrier, Jonathan Pierce remained in the same position he had held for an extended period, his presence unchanged in posture yet increasingly defined by sustained attention rather than reaction. A senior physician approached with another detailed update, explaining that Emily's condition had remained stable through the most recent observation window, with minor but consistent indicators of improvement across multiple physiological metrics. The explanation was careful, avoiding certainty, yet the continuity of progress was no longer dismissible as incidental. Jonathan listened without interruption, his expression composed and controlled, yet his focus remained entirely anchored to the figure inside the ICU room, as if every data point being described was already being translated into something more personal than clinical interpretation. Around them, the hospital maintained its refined operational rhythm, with extended monitoring protocols still active and specialist support continuing without interruption, reflecting an environment that had gradually aligned itself with a single priority without formal acknowledgement. At one point, a nurse quietly reported that Emily had demonstrated repeated responsiveness to external auditory stimuli, subtle but consistent signs that suggested increasing neurological engagement. Jonathan did not respond verbally, but his gaze intensified slightly, as if the accumulation of small confirmations had begun to form a coherent understanding that extended beyond immediate observation. Another memory surfaced again without warning, of Emily Carter performing a quiet act of stabilization within his residence during a moment of internal disruption, not seeking recognition or instruction, but acting with an instinctive sense of order that had gone unnoticed at the time. That memory now carried a different resonance, aligning itself with the present in a way that reinforced an emerging continuity between past presence and current reality. The physician continued to explain procedural expectations and recovery projections, but the language increasingly felt secondary to the live monitoring data displayed within the ICU, where every fluctuation carried immediate relevance. Jonathan finally asked whether uninterrupted stabilization protocols could be maintained through the next critical cycle without degradation in care, and upon receiving confirmation that such continuity required sustained coordination across multiple departments, he gave a brief acknowledgement that immediately translated into reinforcement of existing hospital operational alignment. Communication systems remained active, staffing schedules were extended, and resource distribution continued to adjust quietly to ensure uninterrupted care without visible disruption to external order. Despite these ongoing adjustments, Jonathan did not move closer or step away, remaining positioned at the threshold of observation, as if physical distance no longer defined his involvement in the outcome. Inside the ICU, Emily's condition held within a fragile but increasingly consistent range, her readings reflecting cautious stability that had moved beyond immediate crisis into a state of monitored recovery potential. The surrounding environment continued its controlled rhythm, yet the emotional weight of the situation had evolved into something more enduring, defined not by urgency alone but by sustained responsibility that no longer required external validation. As the hospital continued its quiet adaptation around a single fragile life, Jonathan Pierce remained still, watching through the glass without interruption, as the boundary between detached authority and personal recognition continued to narrow into a space that could no longer be ignored. The hospital had settled into a deep, controlled silence that no longer resembled emergency response but instead reflected sustained medical vigilance, where every movement, every update, and every adjustment existed within a carefully maintained system of continuity. Emily Carter remained in a fragile but increasingly stable condition, her vital signs no longer shifting unpredictably but instead following a narrow range that required constant observation rather than intervention. Medical staff continued their coordinated work across the intensive care unit, ensuring that each reading was verified and each adjustment confirmed through multiple layers of review, maintaining a level of precision that had become routine only through sustained focus. Outside the glass observation barrier, Jonathan Pierce stood in the same position he had maintained throughout the night, his presence unchanged in posture yet increasingly defined by quiet persistence rather than immediate reaction. A senior physician approached with another detailed update, explaining that Emily's condition had remained stable across the most recent monitoring cycle, with continued signs of gradual physiological improvement that were still too early to classify as recovery but significant enough to confirm sustained resilience. Jonathan listened without interruption, his expression composed and controlled, yet his attention remained fully anchored to the figure inside the ICU room, as if every clinical update was now being interpreted through a deeper, more personal framework. Around them, the hospital maintained its structured rhythm, with extended care protocols still active and specialist support continuing without interruption, reflecting an environment that had gradually reorganized itself around a single point of focus without formal acknowledgement or disruption. At one moment, a nurse quietly reported that Emily had demonstrated consistent responsiveness to external auditory cues over an extended period, a detail that reinforced the sense that her condition was no longer static but gradually evolving within controlled parameters. Jonathan did not respond verbally, but his focus sharpened slightly, as if the accumulation of sustained indicators had begun to form a coherent pattern that extended beyond isolated clinical observation. Another memory surfaced without warning, of Emily Carter performing a small but meaningful act of quiet assistance within his household during a moment of internal disruption, not seeking recognition, not requiring instruction, but restoring order with an instinctive sense of responsibility that had once gone unnoticed but now carried increasing significance. That memory did not alter his expression, but it aligned itself with the present in a way that reinforced an emerging continuity between past presence and current reality. The physician continued to outline procedural expectations and recovery projections, yet the language increasingly blended into the background of live monitoring data, where every fluctuation carried immediate relevance. Jonathan finally asked whether uninterrupted stabilization could be maintained through the next extended cycle without degradation in care, and upon receiving confirmation that such continuity required sustained coordination across multiple departments and ongoing resource alignment, he issued a brief acknowledgement that immediately translated into reinforcement of existing hospital operational structures. Communication channels remained active, staffing schedules were extended, and monitoring systems continued to operate without interruption, all quietly adapting to ensure uninterrupted care. Despite these ongoing changes, Jonathan did not move closer or withdraw, remaining positioned at the threshold of observation, as if physical distance no longer defined his involvement in what was unfolding inside the ICU. Inside the room, Emily's condition held within a fragile but increasingly consistent range, her readings reflecting cautious stability that had moved beyond immediate crisis into a state of monitored recovery potential. The surrounding environment continued its controlled rhythm, yet the emotional weight of the situation had evolved into something more enduring, defined not by urgency alone but by sustained responsibility that no longer required explanation or justification. As the hospital continued its quiet adaptation around a single fragile life, Jonathan Pierce remained still, watching through the glass without interruption, as the boundary between detached authority and personal recognition continued to narrow into a space that could no longer be dismissed. The hospital had entered a prolonged state of controlled stability, where the urgency of earlier hours had softened into a continuous, disciplined vigilance that defined every movement within the intensive care unit. Emily Carter remained under constant monitoring, her condition no longer marked by abrupt instability but by a fragile equilibrium that required sustained attention across every level of care. The medical team continued their coordinated operation with precise efficiency, ensuring that every adjustment to her treatment was verified, documented, and cross-checked without interruption. Outside the glass barrier, Jonathan Pierce remained in the same position he had occupied throughout the night, his presence unchanged in posture yet increasingly defined by a quiet form of endurance rather than immediate control. A senior physician approached with another update, explaining that Emily's condition had remained stable through the latest observation cycle, with continued signs of slow but measurable improvement that suggested her body was responding in a consistent and sustained manner. Jonathan listened without interruption, his expression composed and unreadable, yet his attention remained fully anchored to the figure inside the ICU room, as if every clinical update was now being processed through a deeper internal awareness that no longer relied solely on medical interpretation. Around them, the hospital maintained its structured rhythm, with extended monitoring protocols still active and specialist coordination continuing without disruption, reflecting an environment that had gradually aligned itself around a single point of focus without formal acknowledgement. At one moment, a nurse quietly noted that Emily had shown repeated responsiveness to external stimuli over an extended period, a detail that reinforced the emerging pattern of gradual neurological engagement. Jonathan did not respond verbally, but his focus sharpened slightly, as if the accumulation of sustained indicators had begun to form a coherent understanding that extended beyond isolated observation. Another memory surfaced again without warning, of Emily Carter performing a quiet act of organization within his household during a moment of internal disruption, not seeking attention or instruction, but restoring balance with an instinctive sense of responsibility that had once gone unnoticed but now carried increasing significance. That memory aligned itself with the present in a way that reinforced a continuity between past presence and current reality that could no longer be easily dismissed. The physician continued to outline procedural expectations and recovery projections, yet the language increasingly blended into the background of live monitoring data, where every fluctuation carried immediate relevance to ongoing care. Jonathan finally asked whether uninterrupted stabilization could be maintained through the next extended period without degradation in treatment quality, and upon receiving confirmation that such continuity required sustained coordination across multiple departments and ongoing resource alignment, he issued a brief acknowledgement that immediately translated into reinforcement of existing hospital operational structure. Communication systems remained active, staffing schedules were extended, and monitoring protocols continued without interruption, all quietly adapting to ensure continuous care without visible disruption. Despite these ongoing adjustments, Jonathan did not move closer or step away, remaining positioned at the threshold of observation as if physical distance no longer defined his involvement in what was unfolding inside the ICU. Inside the room, Emily's condition held. Within a fragile but increasingly consistent range, her readings reflecting cautious stability that had moved beyond immediate crisis into a state of monitored recovery potential. The surrounding environment continued its controlled rhythm, yet the emotional weight of the situation had evolved into something more enduring, defined not by urgency alone but by sustained responsibility that no longer required explanation or external validation. As the hospital continued its quiet adaptation around a single fragile life, Jonathan Pierce remained still, watching through the glass without interruption, as the boundary between detached authority and personal recognition continued to narrow into a space that could no longer be ignored. The first light of morning began to spread across the hospital corridors, replacing the sterile harshness of artificial lighting with a softer natural glow that revealed the quiet exhaustion of a night spent between uncertainty and controlled medical vigilance. Inside the intensive care unit, Emily Carter remained under continuous observation, her condition now holding within a narrow but stable range that no longer indicated immediate danger but still required sustained and careful monitoring. The medical team continued their work with quiet precision, adjusting treatment protocols only when necessary, documenting every change with a level of discipline that reflected both caution and accumulated experience from the previous hours. Outside the glass barrier, Jonathan Pierce remained standing in the same position he had occupied since the night before, his presence unchanged in posture yet fundamentally altered in significance by everything that had unfolded. A senior physician approached with what would be the most recent consolidated update, explaining that Emily's condition had remained stable through the final observation cycle of the night, with continued gradual improvement across multiple indicators that suggested a slow but consistent trajectory toward recovery. The language remained clinical and restrained, yet the meaning behind it was no longer uncertain, as the progression had moved beyond isolated improvement into sustained stability. Jonathan listened without interruption, his expression composed and controlled, but the focus in his eyes had softened in a way that did not diminish intensity, only redefined it. Around them, the hospital maintained its structured rhythm, yet there was a noticeable easing of tension across the ICU floor, as if the environment itself had adapted to the shift from crisis to monitored recovery. At one point, a nurse quietly confirmed that Emily had shown consistent responsiveness over the past several hours, not as isolated reactions but as repeated signs of engagement that aligned with expected neurological recovery patterns. Jonathan did not respond verbally, but his attention remained fixed on her, absorbing the information without breaking focus. Another memory surfaced once more, clearer and more persistent than before, of Emily Carter performing a quiet act of stability within his household during a moment of internal disruption, not seeking recognition or instruction, but acting with an instinctive sense of responsibility that had gone unnoticed at the time but now carried undeniable relevance. That memory no longer felt separate from the present, but instead appeared as part of a continuous thread that connected past presence with current reality in a way that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The physician continued to outline recovery expectations and continued care requirements, but the urgency of those explanations had softened, replaced by a more measured anticipation of gradual improvement rather than immediate uncertainty. Jonathan finally asked whether continued stabilization could be maintained without interruption through the following day, and upon receiving confirmation that care would remain uninterrupted under existing protocols, he offered a brief acknowledgement that carried no excess instruction, only acceptance of continuity already in motion. Communication systems within the hospital remained active but less strained, staffing rotations had stabilized, and monitoring continued with consistent precision, reflecting an environment that had transitioned fully into sustained care management. Despite these changes, Jonathan did not move closer or step away, remaining positioned at the threshold of observation, as if presence itself had become sufficient without requiring further intervention. Inside the ICU, Emily's condition remained fragile but consistently stable, her readings reflecting a state that no longer belonged to immediate crisis but had entered a carefully maintained path of recovery potential. The surrounding environment continued its quiet rhythm, yet the emotional weight of the situation had transformed into something more enduring, defined not by urgency or intervention, but by sustained attention and responsibility that no longer required justification. As the hospital settled into the calm of early morning, Jonathan Pierce remained still, watching through the glass without interruption, as the boundary between control and recognition finally narrowed into a quiet understanding that could no longer be reversed.